Nat Read's book, From Mountain Man to Mayor, Don Benito Wilson, Los Angeles, 1841 to 1878. We have 2 copies of the book in the Pasadena Public Library for you to check out. Currently, the books are on hold for other people. It's very easy for you to put your own hold in for the book and get it when your turn comes. Call the library and someone can help you at any of our branches, or you can go into one of our branches and organize it. Don Benito Wilson served as mayor of Los Angeles from 1851 to 1852, and he organized the first Los Angeles police force. President Millard Fillmore appointed him Indian agent, and that is the tie-in to National Native American Heritage Month. And as a result of his experience as an Indian agent, Don Benito Wilson wrote a history of the Indians of the area. In 1855 and 1869, he was elected to the California Senate. So I want to tell you a little bit about our author today that has done extensive research. Nat Read is a reader at the Huntington, and that allows you to go in and do hours and hours of research, of which he has done. So when you look at this book, it has an index, it has references to further reading for you, a bibliography, it has lots and lots of pictures, and I know you will find it an invaluable resource about Don Benito Wilson. Nat Read earned a degree in history from Austin College and has written magazine and newspaper articles all of his life. He spent 3 years researching Benjamin Davis Wilson's life, but we need to find out why there is a little bit confusion between Benjamin Davis and Don Benito Wilson. And he read every scrap in the 50 boxes of the B.D. Wilson collection at the Huntington Library, and virtually every English language newspaper that Wilson would have read during his life in Southern California. So I know you're all most anxious to meet Nat Read. We thank him very much for taking his time to present to you at the Pasadena Public Library, and welcome, Nat.
Thank you, Christine. It's great to be here, and I see some familiar names on the Zoom labels. And hello to old friends. I didn't realize there was an election tie-in here. We could have talked about that. For quite a while. In Los Angeles, when we became a state, and thus Los Angeles was to be an American city, there was a coup. There was a coup. It took place in the plaza, and there was a gathering of a number of men who divided up all the offices, and then on election day went out and got the votes. I think there were only a few dozen people voting in the whole county because they weren't used to this yet. And so the original office holders were the people who were in that meeting. They met in a judge's house, and that judge became that judge then became the county judge of Los Angeles, and his name was what's the name of the street? The tourist street off of the plaza. I'm blanking on that, but he was a judge. Our guy, Don Benito Wilson, became the first county clerk. So he's the person who set up American government in Los Angeles, and so much more. So many people haven't heard of Don Benito Wilson, and that's because there was never a book about him. And there's a reason there wasn't a book. The Huntington Library had 50 Alvera Street was what I was trying to think of. It was Judge Alvera that hosted that meeting. The senior historians of Los Angeles, well, it was the leading historian of the alpha male of historians, had access to those 50 boxes of papers of Don Benito Wilson. And in those days, the Huntington Library assigned collections to one scholar. And that scholar had the rights to see that collection, and no one else did. So because Don Benito Wilson was so important, the alpha male historian had access to it. And the alpha male historian put it off and died before he finished. And the new alpha male historian said, stay away from Wilson. I will write the story of the great man. And he died, and this kept going until the Huntington Library changed its policy and opened it to all readers at the Huntington. And my publisher knew about Wilson, and she knew about that gap on the library shelf, and asked me to write it. I knew it was going to take 3 years, so I wasn't real crazy about, tying myself down. But then it grew on me, and I did, and I'm glad I did, and I'm glad it gave due to this great pioneer of Los Angeles. Start at the beginning. He was born in when he was born, the Jefferson and Jefferson Adams were still alive. King George III, the reason for the revolution, was still alive. And perhaps a few dozen people in those 13 American colonies had ever heard of a dusty little pueblo named Los Angeles on the opposite coast. When he died, everyone knew of Los Angeles. There were by then rails in the street. There were wires overhead, multi-story buildings in the downtown, and he spanned that period. He was immensely important. And when you read this book, you will, I promise you will say page after page after page, I can't believe I never heard of this guy. Or if you've heard of him, I can't believe I didn't know all about him, because he is so important in so many ways. He started as a mountain man. Well, he started actually 16 years old. His parents died, and he was an Indian agent in the Deep South. Went to St. Louis, became a mountain man. There were about 1,000 mountain men during that era, and they hunted beavers to be made into beaver hats, which was the fashion in Europe. It was a very dangerous place to be a mountain man. The death rate of mountain men was almost to the decimal point, what it was to be a U.S. Marine in World War II. Very dangerous place. I'll tell you just one story about while he was a mountain man. He stumbled into the camp, into a friendly Indian camp, but it wasn't friendly anymore. He didn't know that. An evil American had come and killed the chief and all the warriors that he could, so that he could take the scalps to Mexico City and get paid whatever it was, $10 a scalp for dead Indians. Well, Wilson didn't know that. So he stumbled in, was not welcome at all. They built a bonfire and we were going to have him for dinner as their guest. They took all of his clothes off of him, tied him to a post, and then began to do their dance. You know, the Lord, thank you for what we're about to, you know, that dance. A friendly Indian slipped his bonds, the rope behind him, binding his hands, and he was able to run away, get out of the camp. He's got no clothes on. And so for like 150 miles, he evaded these Indians. This was their territory. They knew it well. They had horses and they had clothes. So he ended up in Santa Fe, became a trader there, a very successful trader. He was a smuggler, smuggled rum, I think. I don't know what, but he admits that he was a smuggler. And there were a group of Mexicans deeper into Mexico. Santa Fe was part of Mexico, but deeper into Mexico, that were resentful of Americans being in New Mexico. They said, look what happened to Texas when we let them come in and when they promised that they would not try to claim the territory. Look what happened there. And so we're not going to let that happen in New Mexico. And the reason it's not going to happen in New Mexico is because we're going to kill all the Americans. So they were on their way up to Santa Fe to do just that. All of the Americans left. They left in a group, and they left to cross the desert to go to Los Angeles as settlers to Los Angeles. They were the very first settlers to reach Los Angeles. Now, by a coincidence of history, a group of settlers arrived in San Francisco. The two had no knowledge of each other, arrived in San Francisco the day before. So the Great Western Migration began with these two parties, one of them in Los Angeles in 1841, arrived in 1841. Don Benito Wilson was part of that migration. He wasn't Don Benito Wilson yet. He settled, he couldn't own property within 75 miles of the border of Mexico. The border would be the Pacific Ocean. And so he bought the city of Riverside, settled down to be a ranchero, and all of the rancheros were known as Dons. Don Pio Pico, other Dons. And I think it was like Robin Hood. Little John, you remember him? He was the biggest guy in Robin Hood's band, and so they called him Little John. Don Benito, his name was Benjamin in Spanish. Benito. So they called him Don Benito, which is the diminutive of Ben, which he would have been his English name. He immediately got involved in the area. He was elected the alcalde, the mayor of the Inland Empire. There was an unpopular governor at the time, Mikel Torres, and a past governor named Pio Pico said, I would make a better governor than that guy. So the armies of these two, the governor and the past governor, met in the San Fernando Valley. And Don Benito went over to the other side and talked enough people, enough of the armed of the army to trade sides, that Pio Pico prevailed. Governor Micheltorena fled into central Mexico. So now Pio Pico is the governor. And as you know from your California history, Pio Pico would be the last of the governors of Alta California. And he would, and as you read the book, you would find that he would be a pallbearer for Don Benito Wilson. Pio Pico had an immediate job for him. He wanted him to, Pio Pico said, I'll give you my army if you'll lead them into the San Bernardino Mountains and clear out those renegade Indians who are coming down and stealing the cattle. Wilson led them up. They found the leader of those Indians. The leader immediately recognized why Don Benito was there, or why these men had come. They'd come for him. And so he drew his bow and arrow and threaded it, picked up the bow with an arrow, threaded it. How long does that take? Maybe a second and a half. Wilson saw him reach for the bow, and now he knows he doesn't have time to take his rifle from its from where it was on the horse. Doesn't have time to draw the gun. So he does a Hollywood shoot from the hip. Reached for the gun, tilted it, and fired in that same second and a half. And I see so clearly this in the movie that I would like to see made of Don Benito Wilson. As we see super slow-mo, as the Indian picks up the bow and he says, and Don Benito Wilson reaches for his gun, turns it, and we see the bullet and the arrow passing in mid-air, hitting both of the intended victims with fatal shots. The Indian would die of his wounds. Don Benito was hit in the shoulder with a poison arrow, and he fell off his horse, paralyzed, unable to speak. A friendly Indian sucked enough of the poison out of the wound that saved his life. The third time his life was saved by an Indian. Went back to his riverside, and as soon as he got well, he called the men back together because the Indians had fled into Agua Caliente, was what it was called then. We call it Palm Springs today. He was stopped by the chief of the Indians there. That would be Chief Cabazon, who wouldn't let him pass. So Wilson took Chief Cabazon and his warriors captive, said, we'll just wait then until you deliver these men that we're looking for, and then we'll let you go. So his men, Indians that were dispatched, brought back the scalp of these dead Indians. Wilson was grateful. They had a large campaign, gave the entire supply chain to the chief in gratitude. The war came, and both sides wanted Wilson. He was an American, but he was also a leader in Mexico, fluent in Spanish, of course. He decided to go with the Americans. Commodore Stockton gave him a commission in the U.S. Army as a captain, and Don Benito Wilson was the commander of the American forces in Los Angeles went badly for him. He was captured, held as a POW in Boyle Heights. I forgot to mention that he had a daughter before that. He owned Riverside. The neighbor next door owned Orange County, and so he married. He was 32 years old then. Married the 16-year-old daughter of the rancher next door. While he was in prison, a son was born to him. Finally, the war was over, and Don Benito played a key role in sides together because he was an equal citizen of both cultures. He was, as I mentioned before, the county clerk of Los Angeles, but he was semi-literate. We had a city clerk who's semi-literate, so he paid another man to do all of city clerk work, and he gave him the money that came to him for being the city clerk. It was a very, very energetic period for him there. Now he doesn't need to live 75 miles away. So he moved to down Los Angeles, bought Union Station, 12 and a half acres where Union Station is today. What you
Nat, you're muted. We seem to be.
Okay, I pushed unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay,
Thank you
yeah,
very
I
much.
disappeared. Okay, a very energetic period for him. What you must know about Los Angeles, you've seen so many Wild West movies, so many Westerns, and about the gunplay, how dangerous it was to be in the West in those days. That is a myth. That is a myth invented by Hollywood. They were not dangerous towns. The reason they weren't dangerous towns is because in every town, the city marshal collected the guns. As people arrived, he collected their guns, and when they left, he gave them back. A town like Tombstone would have maybe one murder a year, maybe two, maybe zero. That was true of all of the famous old Western towns. But there was one town in the West that was as dangerous as Hollywood pictures it. And that town was Los Angeles. Los Angeles was the most dangerous city in America in that day or till the present, that day or ever. Murder rate was 1,000 times what it is today in Los Angeles at that time. For those of you who passed math in high school, I didn't, maybe you did, you'll understand this, that the number, well, there were 2,700 people in Los Angeles County at that time, 2,700. There are 10 million today, 2,700, 10 million, the number of murders per year is about the same. So it was the most dangerous city. He was living, Union Station, in the very heart of this most dangerous of cities. He had 2 babies, and so he hired a governess to take care of them. She moved in with her worthless husband, and then the worthless husband dies. And now what do you think happened? So he married the governess. They were, so this was the true Cinderella story. She had come from upper class. Name was Margaret Hereford. Her maiden name and her married name were the same because she married her cousin in Alabama. And she had been reduced to taking in laundry by this worthless husband of hers. And now she was married to one of the 3 richest men in Los Angeles. I've read all of her letters. She was a very, very unhappy woman. She married him, had this position of wealth, and she's she's still unhappy. Now he buys up much of Los Angeles, bought Beverly Hills, bought UCLA, bought Santa Monica, bought the port area, bought the West San Gabriel Valley. He owned Pasadena, Altadena, South Pasadena. He owned everything between Glendale and Arcadia, from the mountains to, do you know where the trench, the railroad trench is that runs through Alhambra? Down below, you cross over it on the road. That was the boundary between ranches at the time, and that was the limit of what he owned in the West San Gabriel Valley. He had orange groves. He invented the icon of Southern California, the massive orange groves. His invention. He was a vintner, raised grapes in Alhambra and San Marino, and he supplied wine to Napa and Sonoma in those days. He was on the board of the first oil company. He brought railroads to Southern California. The first manufacturing plant. He was the second mayor. Well, he was a city clerk, the founding city clerk. You know that. He was on the city council as well. Was the second mayor of Los Angeles. He was the state senator for everything from Tulare to the Mexican border, from the Pacific Ocean to the Colorado River. All of that was so sparsely settled that it was in one senatorial district. 2/3 of the state Senate today is from that, from what he presided over alone. Very, very successful, and died in 1878. And what happened to all of that? Well, with Margaret Hereford, he had 2 daughters. So he had the daughter from the first marriage, And then I told you that he had a son while he was a POW. That son was a ne'er-do-well, worthless, committed suicide in Don Benito's hotel. He was also the Ritz. He owned the Ritz-Carlton of Los Angeles at that day. So he had two daughters with Margaret Hereford. They married the same man at the same time. There were Annie and Sue. Sue was the eldest and youngest. Annie was the oldest. Both loved the same man. And he married Sue, the younger. Annie wasn't giving up. She showed up at the train station with her bags packed to go on their honeymoon with him. They somehow talked her out of that, but she was waiting when they came back, moved in with them, was with them every year of the husband's life. So for all intents and purposes, he had two wives. His biographer said that they shared everything but his bed. I looked for the footnote. Oh yeah, what's the source? What's the source of that? That's a pretty bold statement. There is, of course, no documentation of that. But for all intents and purposes, he had two wives. He was. They had a son, and the son was, for all intents and purposes, it had two mothers. He didn't know the difference. They were both around all day, every day. Didn't see them when they went into their room at night. So he was. So he was someone with two mothers. And I am fighting the memory of an old man for the name of the famous World War II general.
General Patton.
I'm sorry?
Patton. General Patton.
General Patton, yes, thank you.
Yeah, George Patton.
George Smith Patton Jr. had the two mothers. The other daughter, the daughter from his first marriage, also married extremely well. They were two very different families. She was Catholic. They had 11 children, and Patton's family was Protestant. They were Episcopal. George Patton, the general, greatly resented the grandfather, Don Benito Wilson, being in his family tree, because he was a proud Virginian, and said that she had fouled the family line by marrying a Mexican and by marrying a Catholic, and the shame it had brought on the family that she had 11 children. So I'm not kind to General Patton in the book, because he was not at all. He just resented the fact that when people compared him to to the military successes of his grandfather. He would rail at that. So I'm going to cut it off there. There's so much more that we could talk about of this very active, very famous man, and see if you have questions. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Nat, for that wonderful presentation and an explanation of why, first of all, we thought, or I thought Don Benito Wilson had another name starting with Benjamin, and he became a Don when he owned his own property in Riverside.
Right.
So where does the Shorb family come into everything?
Oh, that's who married Sue, the first daughter. So that was his. Shorb was his daughter-in-law. Shorb was a surrogate son of Don Benito Wilson. I told you that his son committed suicide, so he wasn't able to share this wealth and this position with his son, and Shorb became that son, and was the partner of Don Benito Wilson in all of his business affairs. And Don Benito lived modestly compared to his wealth. He didn't spend money lavishly, but Shorb did. Traveled in his own rail car, and he died. Left his widow, the daughter of Don Benito, in bankruptcy, and all of that was lost because of Shorb's overspending. There is, you back to the Don Benito, the diminutive. There is a statue in Alhambra of Don Benito Wilson, and he must be, I don't know, maybe 5'10". This small statue, this little man, Don Benito. And Don Benito was, you're looking at Don Benito. He was 6 feet tall. He was 180 pounds. But how would they know? No one had written the book. So this picture, this little man down there, isn't at all what Don Benito looks like. What, another question?
Yes, well, talk us a little bit. I read about when he went to at Big Bear Lake in 1845. He was asked to pursue a group of Native Americans led by a man who escaped from the San Gabriel mission.
We talked about that. That was the chief that shot him with the bow and arrow.
Oh, that was the chief.
These were the first non-Indians ever to go into the San Bernardino Mountains.
Okay.
And they killed I don't remember the number now, maybe a dozen bears, grizzly bears, in a few days. And so he named the place Bear Lake.
Okay. So this son-in-law, James Shorb, actually was the one that named San Marino. Is that correct?
That could be. I'm not sure, because Wilson's dead by then when they formed San Marino, and my research stopped. So I don't know what came after. I don't know how that came. But I do know that no, I don't think it would have. I think it would have been Patton. Patton was the force there. I could be wrong there. Patton. One other element of Wilson's life. He was a vintner. I told you that. He looked up at the mountain and saw a forest at the top of the mountain, and he thought those would make good barrel staves. So he built a road to the top of the mountain not a trail, a road that you could pull a wagon up. And after 3 days of harvesting, you realize that wood didn't work for barrel staves, but he had built the road. It became a toll road. A lot of important things happened on that mountain, and so it was named Mount Wilson for him. It came from his place in San Marino by Wilson's Lake, and so it went from Wilson's Lake to Wilson's Peak, and the road then was named Lake Wilson. No, that's not right. But anyway, it's the name Lake Avenue. It's where Lake Avenue got its name, that road that ran from one to the other. Patton, Senior Patton, changed the name of that road to Virginia Avenue in San Marino after his beloved state. Anyway, next question.
Okay, so what are your own thoughts about Don Benito? Do you admire him? Do you think he was successful? What he did?
That's a really, really good question. And it's the question I ask every biographer. What would you ask that person if we could dig them up and you could talk to them? And what I would ask him is this north-south thing. He is from the South. He had the prejudices of some of the prejudices of a Southern man. But what was his feeling? And then he gave land to the U.S. government to bring thousands of soldiers here to keep Los Angeles in the Union. And I'd like to know, this seems a dichotomy there. You mentioned about his being an Indian agent. He was the first Indian agent for Southern California. And at the end of his life, after everything that he had done, mayor, senator, vastly wealthy, he said the thing that was most important to him was being the first Indian agent in Southern California. Next question.
And he wrote a book about that, correct? Is that book available at the Huntington?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, it's available, and it's available on the internet. I'm sure the library has a copy of it. But here comes that old question. He was the city clerk, semi-literate. He wrote this book. How do you write this book? Semi-literate, backwoodsman. It was, I'm sure, I think, I'm sure, one of the judges in town that ghost wrote it, and he put his name on it.
So they probably sat and had conversations, and he told the judge his thoughts, and then the judge would write them down. Do you think?
Yes. Yeah. He was Wilson was such a friend of the Indians. He lived in Indian country all those years, and some Indians were enemies, some were friends, but he was placed by the President of the United States in charge of caring for them. And so he brought, organized bear hunts to bring back meat, for the Indians and to take care of them. And he finally quit. He resigned that post because he said, nation is being dishonest about Indians, and it is not being fair to the Indians. And he said, I'm not going to be part of the system that treats them this way.
Well, okay. So now if anyone else has any question they would like to put into chat, please do so, because Nat is very happy to answer it. So you've spent 3 years researching Don Benito Wilson. Is there any other California men or women that you're thinking of writing about?
Oh, no, I'm through with
No.
The early history. Well, actually, that's not true. I am proposing a book to my publisher, but I'm deciding whether I want to tie myself down. So I might, but it wouldn't be about one. It would be about the period.
Well, a history book about the period, when that would be fascinating. So someone's asking the question, was Wilson acquainted with Rowland or Workman at the time?
The name of the party, the name of the organizers of that group that came over to Los Angeles were Rowland and Workman. It was the Rowland Workman Party. So he was intimately familiar with him. He was part of their caravan.
So don't we have a Workman Street in Los Angeles, or a Workman area? But I'm not. And where's Rowland? Do we have something named after Rowland?
Rowland Heights, yeah.
Oh.
Yes, there are lots of things named for both of them.
Okay, so what became of his land? He then gave it all to Riverside, and it's become Riverside. What became to all of his land throughout California? He sold it? Is that how he made his vast fortune, to sell it?
No, he sold Riverside to a man named Rubidoux, and that area took his name. The other land, he bought and sold land, and did very, very well at that. And so that estate was what was lost in the bankruptcy.
Okay. All right. So what else? He organized the first Los Angeles police force. When actually was that?
It was when he was on the LA City Council, and he tried to organize it as a police department. He couldn't get the votes to do that. So it was the city marshal, who amounts to the name police that we use today. This was I tell you, it was a very dangerous town. The first chief of police was killed in a gun battle. The gun battle was with his assistant. They were arguing over who gets the reward money for somebody that was captured. The second sheriff was killed in a gunfight with a large gang that had moved into the area. So a very, very dangerous time, of course, for police as well as everybody else.
So today we continue to see his legacy throughout this whole area. As you said, you talked about Mount Wilson is named after him. We've got Wilson Avenue in Pasadena, and
Right.
we have Don Benito School.
Yeah.
So what other places do we have?
Well, the Don Benito School is interesting. When he sold, he and a partner named John Griffin owned together the northwest part of, well, they owned all of this, but they owned this northwest portion, and Griffin wanted them to split it up so that they each had owners. It wasn't in common. They owned it separately, and so they split it, and Griffin immediately sold it to the basically the Indiana colony people who were looking for a place to put down roots as their city. And the eastern boundary of Pasadena then was Fair Oaks Road. Fair Oaks Road led to Fair Oaks Ranch, which was the ranch of the widow of a city, a Southern general who was killed there, and she named the place Fair Oaks. That was the boundary. They wanted the Pasadenans wanted more land. So Wilson, now, who owned the other part, sold some of his for like 10 times what Griffin sold his for. And so the boundary between Pasadena and Old Pasadena was Fair Oaks, and it is to this day, the division between East and West, and that's why it comes from that. Then I was going to say about, so Wilson sold his land, and he gave them large acreage at the corner of Fair Oaks and Colorado to build a high school and community house. And then that became the center of Pasadena. It became extremely valuable land, this high school, too valuable to keep as a high school. So they sold it in an auction, but they promised that when they built another school, it would be Wilson School, because they had torn down Wilson School in that process. And they forgot about it. They forgot about it. Somebody researching the Pasadena Unified School District realized in later years that promise had been made. But by then we had a Wilson School, it was named for Woodrow Wilson. And so they wanted to honor that promise, but they couldn't name it Wilson School, so they named it for the first name, Don Benito.
Well, this has been such a fascinating program. You know so much about not only Don Benito Wilson, but about Pasadena. We could keep talking about Pasadena. And I think what it's done, in addition to the biographical information about Don Benito Wilson, it's opened our eyes when we drive around Pasadena. We'll pay more attention to Mount Wilson, Wilson Road, Don Benito Wilson. That we'll go look for that area off of Fair Oaks. So it gives us lots of insight. So I hope everyone will take a chance to check out the book from Pasadena Public Library. And we won't be able to get it now because it's available for other people that have put a hold on it, but you can put a hold on it and reserve it for you at your local library. So we thank you so much, Nat, for coming and sharing your story and all your 3 years of research. And I actually think it was probably a lot longer than 3 years when you come down to count it all up, because it's so much information there. So thank you for coming to listen to Nat Read talk about his book, From Mountain Man to Mayor, Don Benito Wilson, Los Angeles, 1841 to 1878. And he was an Indian agent, something that we might not have really have known about Don Benito Wilson. So thank you so much, Nat. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Good night.